Welcome to Melbourne Inclusive Church. We boldly and proudly proclaim Christ's equal love for all people, regardless of their ability, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, age, gender, or culture. All are welcome to come as you are. God bless and enjoy the podcast. Please welcome Susan Cottrell.
So good to see you all here. You all are a sight for sore eyes. My husband Rob and I raised our 5 kids, in the Evangelical church for 20 years. We were leaders, we led small groups, and then our daughter Annie came out as bisexual. And the church said, "Yay, we're so happy for you." No, they didn't. They said it's a sin and you can't accept it. Like it was a job offer somewhere and they didn't pay enough, so I couldn't accept it. Instead of, actually, it's my daughter. Yeah, it's not a sin, and you bet I'm going to accept her. But what are you talking about? Rob and I found ourselves having to choose between our church and our child. And they kind of like to frame it as though you're choosing between God and your child. But be very clear, it's not between God and your child. It's between your church and your child, between your theology and your child. But to choose your child is to choose God, because God gave you that child. For those of you whose parents didn't choose you, I'm very sorry about that. Nobody should experience family rejection, least of all in the name of God. You know, God, who Jesus represents, who says we're all included, that God. Nobody should be rejected in that God's name. And after Annie came out, and months after, and we were already completely affirming, she said, "Are you sure you and Dad won't reject me even later?" It's like, I am sure, but why are you asking? It's too low. Pay no attention to this. Yeah. And then she told me about friends of hers who had been literally thrown out to the streets after they came out. And I was just horrified. You see, when you're in that evangelical church setting, or conservative, non-affirming, whatever the words are here, church setting, you don't know that's happening. You don't see it because they don't tell you about it. It's like they take it through the kitchen and out the back door into the alley. They don't parade it in the front where you see it. So, and I'll tell you that the toughest part of this journey, so after she came out, it set us on a journey to really figure out what our theology was. Why is this such a big deal? The Bible surely must be very clear for them to take such a stand. So we read it. It actually was said very little, and none of it could really apply to relationships today. I was really kind of sad about that and a little angry to find out that we'd been basically lied to about this community. The toughest part of this journey was not the theology. That part's easy. It was a loss of community. It was discovering that this church family was conditional, that this come as you are, fully inclusive, or, including you, unconditional love actually had conditions, and you didn't know it until you crossed those conditions. If you can find real community, like this one seems to be, certainly, then I recommend that. But false community, I don't recommend that at all. Raise your hand if you have never been hurt by Christians because of your gender or sexuality. Nobody raised their hand. I find that an incredible indictment. And do you ever wonder why that is, when Jesus is so beautiful and so much about including, especially those on the margins, those with the least power, the least visibility, the least esteem in the culture? Yeah. Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven. Have you read that phrase, the kingdom of heaven? Well, he says it a number of times. What does he mean by that? And how could people who are promised the kingdom of heaven inflict the kind of pain that we have endured as a community? That's what I want to talk about. So let's look at 3 ways that kingdom of heaven can be interpreted. The first interpretation is what the actual biblical people at the time thought it meant. The Jews at the time expected their long-anticipated Messiah to come in, clean house, and take names, and get rid of their oppressors. That's what they expected. They expected to be freed from Roman occupation, redress their grievances, and right all their wrongs. That's what they thought their Messiah would do. And they were a very wronged people, an oppressed people. But that didn't happen. Jesus died without freeing the Jews from Roman rule, without fixing any of the broken human systems. In fact, that system is what crucified him. So that one is a non-starter. So the apostles had to reframe their thinking about what Jesus might have meant, since he obviously did not bring about this earthly restoration that they expected. Then Paul and the early church thought, okay, he'll be coming back soon. That's what he meant. Any minute he'll be coming back. And Paul very clearly expected Jesus to come back within his lifetime. But as time went on and Jesus kept not coming back, they had to keep pushing that expectation back further and further. And still, every generation since then has expected Jesus to come back any minute. That's the second interpretation of the kingdom of heaven. Jesus will bring restoration, both eschatologically, which means in the end times, and also individually, which means as we go to heaven. That's the interpretation now that he's evolved about kingdom of heaven. So the kingdom of heaven is the sweet by and by in the sky when I die. I just went to Dandenong Mountain yesterday, and they have pie in the sky restaurant. So, cafe. So that's a little taste of heaven. That's what that's saying. It's a final reckoning in heaven where those wronged will be recompensed. And, of course, hell, where punishment is dished out, because what's heaven without hell? I'm making a joke there. There's more to that. So in the end, we'll get our just rewards, and those who have oppressed us will go to hell. That's kind of the theology. This must be what Jesus meant. Okay, I'll tell you the problems with that in a minute. Then there's the third interpretation of the kingdom of heaven. That's God's presence in and with us now. God's immanence, which means God's presence permanently pervading and sustaining the universe. And that beautiful presence is with us now. To say the kingdom of heaven is at hand then means God is right here, right now. The kingdom of heaven manifests itself in a social gospel of caring for each other, beauty transpiring in humankind. This is a very different understanding from pie in the sky when I die, and it has profoundly different impact for who we are and how we shall live our lives. So, and those ideas will take you very different places. So if you get on a train, you want to know where it ends up before you get on the train. So let's look where these end up before we get on these trains of thought. If we look at the kingdom of heaven is about heaven, or the sweet by and by in the sky when I die, then that is necessarily focused on the future, on eternal reward that will come someday. And it's necessarily useless now. You may have heard the expression that people are so heavenly minded, they're no earthly good. That's what that means. This kingdom of heaven is essentially about preparing for heaven by keeping myself good enough now instead of living now. Future focus is about piling up rewards in heaven. And if you include hell in that focus, which a lot of Christian doctrine does, then the preoccupation moves to being sure you're going to heaven and not hell. You with me so far? Now let me insert here that I believe in heaven. I absolutely, plan on heaven. I expect to see my mother and brothers and other people that have died already. It's like dessert at the end of the meal. And it's all of the enjoyment of life without the tiredness and the frustration and the aging and the, well, you know, that stuff that happens to other people. But heaven was never meant to be a threat that you won't get it if you don't behave. It's never meant to be that. So a lot of parents say, you eat your vegetables and then you get dessert. If in the end it makes you hate vegetables, instead of saying, hey, this is an excellent dish that's really good for you, and in addition, you get dessert. It's unconditional. But when you make it a condition of eating your vegetables, then you come to hate vegetables and you just tolerate them. And I think a lot of Christian doctrine leads us to hate this life and tolerate it because we're piling up rewards in heaven. We're the biggest curmudgeons there ever were, but we're doing it for Jesus. I don't know. I kind of think that's not what he meant. And to use fear to motivate is the lowest form of relationship, isn't it? You might use that for a toddler or a preschooler if you have to in an extreme circumstance because you can't have them running in the street. But you don't continue that. That's like a last-ditch, I'm going to save your life kind of thing. But that's not how Jesus talked to us, was it? You know, he said, I don't even call you, I don't call you my servants. I call you my friends. Because a servant doesn't know what the master's doing. But I call you my friends. I infinitely prefer being a friend to Jesus than a servant. And that doesn't mean I don't serve wholeheartedly. I absolutely do. I serve better as a friend than I do as a servant. But the relationship's different. Fear as motivation is a human invention. And make no mistake, that fear is intentional. It's really easy to make a lot of people comply when fear is your motivation. It gains compliance. When glass was introduced back in the, hundreds of years ago, whenever that was, they said that if you break it, it will be bad luck. That's a fear motivation. Why did they do that? Because those paying for the glass were not the same ones who were moving it and could break it. If you break it and you didn't pay for it, oops, I broke it. But if you pay it and if you broke it and you're the one who pays for it because you have bad luck, then you're a lot more careful. Does that make sense? That's how fear motivation works. But that's not what Jesus does. And that's really dangerous. This fear expands to fill every corner of our lives. So not only do I have to be good enough to heaven to maintain my ticket to heaven, but I have to make sure others are good enough too for my ticket to heaven. How did we get to that? That's a really strange thing to do. I'm going to punish you if your brother breaks the vase. What? It just doesn't quite make sense. And you've probably seen what this correction looks like. It looks like the pastor declaring his list of right and wrong, even though Jesus never gave us a list of what's right and what's wrong, except it's right to love each other. That's all he said about it. In fact, Jesus just said, follow me. He commended people's faith and how they treated each other, not their right and wrong list. The religious leaders kept bringing him a right and wrong list, and he said, you don't understand God. He wasn't impressed with their perfect piety either. Hello. It's not about perfect personal piety. It's not about that. It's about community. You'd think maybe religious leaders might have heard his response to the previous religious leaders, but they don't seem to have. That, maybe they would say, let's be less focused on personal piety and rules and more focused on following Jesus in the here and now and loving the people he said to love. In family, this rules-based, saving up for heaven thing looks like excluding someone you think is wrong. How did that figure into following Christ? And how does that reflect Christ? It does not at all. And there's probably nothing more reprehensible to the gospel than to break community, to exile someone outside their people because we don't approve of them. Yeah. If you've been hurt in this way, excluded from church, from family, let me tell you, that treatment has nothing to do with God, and it has nothing to do with you. It has to do with the conditioning of those who are excluding you. I really want you to let that soak in. At this point, you might be saying, okay, well, let's talk about that other way of kingdom of heaven. Instead of piling up rewards in the sweet by and by, what's the other way? Well, it's a beautiful picture. And it looks like the Good Samaritan, freed now from the fear of contaminating himself by touching that wretched sinner, which is what the religious leaders were afraid of. Well, the Good Samaritan didn't have that fear. He just picked him up and helped him and took him to get nursing the way he needed it. And that's love and that's life. It looks like being able to grant people their full humanity without holding a plebiscite to do it. It looks like social justice. Imagine if Christians put their vast time, energy, resources, and all-out privilege into helping the homeless and the hungry and freeing people from sex trafficking. How would that change our world? Maybe even healing race relations. I don't know how that is here, but that's a big issue in the U.S. Instead of worrying about the sexual activity of two consenting adults. And while I believe that Jesus held out the hope of heaven, life beyond our earthly death, when he offered eternal life, he didn't mean your life plus eternity tacked onto the end. It's not what he meant. He meant that the abundant life is life here and now. It's a whole different paradigm. Jesus states this freedom for the here and now many times. He says, consider the lilies of the field. They don't toil and work, and they're dressed better than Solomon in all his robes. And he says, consider the birds of the air. They don't worry about their food, but God provides for them. And he also said, my burden is easy and my yoke is light. There's nothing easy or light about trying to change other people or even trying to change your own gender identity or sexuality. There's nothing easy about that. Especially when you're trying to you're building up your own superannuation fund in heaven. That's not what it was all about here. When Jesus does talk about storing up treasures for yourself in heaven, where it's safe and not on earth, where it's can be destroyed, he's talking about it in the here and now. He's not talking about, stealing life away now and putting it in your annuation fund there so it will accrue, so you have it when you retire in heaven. That is not at all what he means. He means when you give now, the more you give now, the more you love now, the more you share now, the kinder you are now, the more it all is present for you in heaven. That feels like it is a whole different paradigm. It's being kind now, it's trusting in God's provision now, like the birds and the flowers, and it's loving people now without trying to change them, which is kind of a ridiculous assignment, wouldn't it be? Love means accepting people as they are with room for who they may become. Okay, I can do that. I can't change anybody's sexuality. I can't even change my own sexuality. I can't change my own, shortcomings. But I can, I'm not saying that's a shortcoming. I'm saying whatever I think I might need to change, I can't change that. But I can love. I can accept others, and I can accept myself as I am right now, as you are right now, with room for who we may become. That sounds to me like the kingdom of heaven here and now. So safe community is what it's all supposed to be about. You just look at how Jesus lived. As much as we think of him healing and feeding and doing for people, which he did generously, it only accounts for about 10% of his time if you lay it all out. But the 90% of the time is just hanging out, just being in community. I love that. Many of our churches, however, kind of have those percentages wrong. We spend 90% of the time cajoling, fixing, correcting, doing, thinking, changing, teaching, with just a little 10% left just to be together. But the being together is so much of our community. It's no wonder everybody's exhausted. Jesus connected with people, he loved people, and he hung out with people. And especially the least of these is the phrase he used, meaning not least worthy, but least valued in the culture, least resourced, least visible. That's what he was talking about. And he was constantly moved to compassion by the plight of the human condition. He was not constantly fixing people or certainly not changing their behavior. He was inviting them to follow him, and he was giving them life in community, in relationship. That sounds like the kingdom of heaven to me. Jesus is about abundant life, setting free the captives, healing the wounded. He's about trusting, believing, not worrying, and for heaven's sake, not being afraid. Following him, we can rest and be at peace. We can create safe community that's full of life and love. Jesus is safe, and Jesus wants us to know that we are safe with him. We can take heart that the only ones he was harsh with, you know who they were? Is the religious leaders who excluded others. That's the only people he was harsh with. Not the prostitutes, not the tax collectors, not the other races, not the immigrants, not the differently gendered, none of that. Not the eunuch who we concede a lot of this community falling into. That was the word they had, really. He wasn't harsh with any of those. Why would he be? So where do we go from there? We've talked about the hurt that we have endured in this community, and I want to leave you with a couple of practical steps toward healing. As you think about those who have hurt you, realize that you have a choice about whether to continue in those relationships. You do not have to stay in a relationship where you feel hurt and continually wounded, where they're not willing to listen to you. Sometimes the relationship's more harmful than helpful, and to care for yourself and love yourself means to stop that relationship and instead redirect your energy into finding safe community. Number 2 is, if you wonder how God feels about you, even in the dark of night, I want you to do this. I want you to make a list of all the qualities of the person you love the most, your partner, a friend, a family member that you love. And then make a list of all the things you're afraid of about God, that you've been told about God. And realize as you look at real God, the God that Jesus described, that God fits this list of the friend qualities, not the list of what you've been told about God. Number 3 is, I encourage you to trust you. Trust your gut. It knows you really well, and it will guide you without mistake if you listen. You really do know better than anyone what's healthy for you, what's good for you, what's right for you. You're loved and you're not alone. It is a real blessing to do this work. I talk to people all the time. I get emails from people. I encourage them. I love them well. And that is the task that we've been given in the here and now, to love well. It's just not that hard to do. And I encourage you to love others well and love yourselves well. That's indispensable to that equation. It's a blessing to be here with you. And if you have any questions, I'd love to answer them. Thank you very much.
Go ahead, Nate.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, your daughter coming out as bi, I wonder, is that a real turning point in your understanding of
Yes.
theological
Yes.
to make it more broad? Because my experience in the States of evangelical churches is that they have it quite narrow, not just in our community, but in all the other communities.
Yes, that's exactly what happened. She came out, and that's when I realized, that's when God just showed me how this community had been rejected by the church that I was a part of, and I didn't know that. It was invisible to us. And it was like, okay, who else has been rejected? And I started having conversations with people of color, with, women, I already know that, and more conversations about that. I started to open these boxes of people that weren't in our church. Why aren't they in our churches if we're the love of Christ and the body of Christ? So it did. It opened all those boxes. And now those are the people I speak to predominantly because they're the ones that Jesus spoke to and called us to be caring about. And I do speak truth to power the way Jesus did. And so you love downline, you love those with less power, and you speak truth to those with more power. And that's what I do every day. But I didn't see it until I saw it. You know, and I sometimes people will say, well, your daughter had to come out before you cared about the community. I'm like, actually, I had gay friends. It's just my daughter had to come out before I saw what was happening to the community in those churches. And I speak to a lot of parents for the same reason, because they don't know it. And even people will comment back and say, well, the church isn't doing that. Like, yeah, it really is. You haven't been on the receiving end. Why would you? It's like saying our teenagers aren't having sex in our church. You're like, you think they're going to tell you that they are? Yeah. And those people you've rejected, do they come back, or do you listen when they do? So, yeah. Thanks. It's a really good question. Was there more to that, or? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Well, I really do love when God speaks to me clearly. And, like you know God's voice. Jesus said we would. And also our younger daughter came out as well. So we have 2 out of 5, which I find a badge of honor. Somebody else. Yes. So, and our bi daughter is now married to a man. So, but the younger daughter has no plans to be with a man ever, so so it's all good. And that man is, my daughter's husband is now relooking at his gender, so yeah, so we got a lot of rainbow stuff going on. Yeah. But it's a joy. Yes. Yes, that's right. Very much what? The dominant narrative. Yes. Yes, it is. And I don't really have the ear of the main pastors in those circumstances, usually, but I have the ear of parents in those denominations and other leadership, and I'm just sort of picking away at it piece by piece, like a, construction, like a building, and you come and you take out beams underneath. That's what I'm doing, and hoping the thing collapses to at least some degree. The patriarchy, not church, but the patriarchy. So yeah, it's if they're not listening, then there's no point in speaking to them. But there are plenty of people within who are listening, and we, my husband and I, believe that the pews and the pulpits are full of people just waiting for permission to love well. How did it get so switched that it's about behaving in a certain way, personal piety, instead of loving well, when that's what Jesus said? So that's what I really talk to people about a lot. Did that answer your question? Yeah, you're welcome. Oh, God, help us to hear your voice of love and kindness. Please dismantle our shame and our fear, and help us experience the kingdom of heaven in the here and now. Help us to love you and each other and ourselves here and now. just as you love us so fully. And help us recognize and experience your unconditional love and your amazing grace here and now. In Jesus' name, amen.